Berlin, April 22nd, 1945. Deep beneath the shattered chancellery, 50 feet of reinforced concrete is the only thing separating Adolf Hitler from the vengeance of the Red Army. The air in the Führer bunker is stale, smelling of sweat, damp earth, and the undeniable stench of a dying empire. Adolf Hitler sits hunched over a map of a Germany that no longer exists. His hands, once used to command the destiny of nations, now tremble uncontrollably. His face is a mask of gray fatigue. For years, he believed he was the master of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. But in these final, claustrophobic hours, he isn't reminiscing about his own triumphs. He is speaking about the one man who stole his lightning. Patton. Hitler whispers, his voice a dry rasp. Patton is the one you could never stop. The room filled with high-ranking officers who once dreamed of world conquest falls into a haunted silence. They don't argue. They don't offer excuses, because they know that in the chaos of the Western Front, George S. Patton wasn't just a general. He was a force of nature that the German war machine simply could not calculate. To understand why the most powerful dictator in the world became obsessed with an American general, we have to look back to the moment Hitler made his greatest mistake. He underestimated the American spirit. March 1943. North Africa. The reports arriving at the Wolf's Lair were glowing. Rommel's Africa Corps had just decimated American forces at Kasserine Pass. Thousands of Americans were captured, their tanks left smoldering in the desert heat. Hitler read the reports and allowed himself a smug smile. To him, Americans were not warriors. They were merchants. Soft, pampered men playing at a game they didn't understand. He genuinely believed that the U.S. Army would fold the moment they faced the master race. But then a new name appeared in the intelligence briefs, George S. Patton. He was given command of the shattered Second Corps. At first, Hitler barely blinked. To him, it was just another name, another inevitable failure. He was wrong. Only 3 weeks later, those same broken American units struck back at El Guetar. They didn't just attack. They fought with a terrifying, calculated aggression. German positions that were thought to be impregnable were overrun in hours. Hitler frowned at the map. One man shouldn't make this much of a difference, he muttered. His staff tried to reassure him. They called Patton a reckless cowboy who would eventually destroy himself. Hitler chose to believe them. He put Patton out of his mind, dismissing the victory as a fluke. He didn't realize that the merchant had just found his greatest salesman of destruction. July 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Hitler's gaze was fixed on the British general Bernard Montgomery. In the Führer's mind, Montgomery was the textbook threat, methodical, slow, and predictable. The Americans, they were still a secondary concern. But then the reports started coming in like fever dreams. Patton wasn't just advancing, he was flying. He was racing across Sicily through mountain passes that German engineers had labeled impassable for armor. He ignored supply lines. He bypassed strong points. He was moving so fast that German intelligence couldn't update their maps fast enough. When Patton reached Messina, first beating Montgomery to the prize and mocking the German defensive plan, Hitler called an emergency conference. He demanded to know who this man was. The file landed on his desk. A 57-year-old cavalryman who believed he had been a Greek hoplite and a Napoleonic marshal in past lives. A man who wore ivory-handled revolvers like a character from an American Western. Hitler laughed. He dismissed Patton as a theatrical showman, all flash and no substance. He thought Patton was more interested in his own legend than in strategy. But General Alfred Jodl, the man responsible for German operations, saw something deeper. He looked at the chaos Patton left in his wake and warned, "Mein Führer Patton does not think like a modern general. He thinks like a raider. Hitler paused. A raider doesn't care about holding ground or protecting his flanks. A raider seeks to shatter the enemy's spirit. For the first time, Hitler began to feel a sliver of genuine unease. This wasn't a merchant playing at war. This was a predator. Spring 1944, the most critical moment of the war. Hitler was obsessed with one question: where would the Allies land in France? He knew his Atlantic Wall could only hold if he placed his strongest divisions in the right spot. German intelligence looked for the man they feared most. They found him in southeast England, commanding the 1st U.S. Army Group. Fusag positioned directly across from Pas-de-Calais. To Hitler, the logic was ironclad. The Allies would never waste their most aggressive, most dangerous offensive general on a diversion. Where Patton was the real invasion would be. Hitler ordered the 15th Army 15 elite divisions, the strongest force in France, to stay at Calais and wait for Patton. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The world watched as the Allies landed at Normandy. But Hitler's first question wasn't about the beaches. It was, where is Patton? The answer: Patton was still in England, still at Calais. Hitler relaxed. He told his generals that Normandy was the fake. He believed the real invasion, led by his rival Patton, was still coming. For 7 critical weeks, while Erwin Rommel begged for reinforcements to save the German lines at Normandy, Hitler kept his best troops sitting idle at Calais, staring at the sea, waiting for a general who wasn't there. By the time Hitler realized the truth, it was too late. The 1st U.S. Army Group didn't exist. The tanks were made of rubber. The planes were made of wood. The radio traffic was a script. Patton had been commanding an army of ghosts. Witnesses say that when Hitler finally realized he had been outplayed, he didn't scream. He didn't rage. He sat in a stunned, cold silence, staring at the map. The Allies had used Hitler's own respect and fear of Patton as a weapon against him. He had been outthought by the showman, and the humiliation was only just beginning. August 1st, 1944. The deception was over. The ghost became flesh and blood. George S. Patton was activated in Normandy at the head of the Third Army, and the German Western Front began to disintegrate at a terrifying speed. For Hitler, the morning briefings in August became a ritual of despair. Each day, the pins on the map representing Patton's tanks had moved farther than anyone thought physically possible. On August 3rd, the Third Army broke through at Avranches. Hitler screamed for an immediate counterattack. He ordered his commanders to seal the breach and contain the madman. But Patton wasn't waiting to be contained. By August 7th, the German counterattack at Mortain failed miserably. Why? Because Patton was already 50 miles behind them. Hitler stared at the map in the wolf's lair, his eyes wide with disbelief. How? He demanded. How can they move this fast? His logistics officers explained that by all military doctrine, Patton should have stopped. He was outrunning his fuel, outrunning his food, and leaving his flanks wide open. According to the German way of war, Patton was being reckless. He was breaking every rule in the book. Hitler's response was cold. But he hasn't stopped, has he? By August 15th, Patton's tanks were 150 miles from their starting point. Field Marshal von Kluge sent a desperate message to Hitler. Mein Führer, we cannot establish a defensive line. Every position we prepare Patton is already past it, before the concrete is dry. This was Hitler's ultimate nightmare. The German military, the Wehrmacht, was built on precision calculation and predictable operations. They could fight an enemy who followed the rules. But Patton made prediction impossible. He was fighting with a tempo that moved faster than the German brain could process. Hitler had built the Blitzkrieg, but now he was watching an American do it better, faster, and with a relentless aggression that bordered on the suicidal. December 1944. Hitler decided to play his final card. He gathered his last reserves, hundreds of tanks, elite SS divisions, for a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. This was the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, the German storm broke. American lines collapsed. Entire divisions were surrounded. The strategic town of Bastogne was cut off. Hitler watched the reports with a renewed sense of life. This was his masterpiece. He was proving to the world that Germany could still strike like a viper. But as he paced his command center, he was looking for one specific detail. "Where is Patton?" The answer brought Hitler genuine relief. Patton's Third Army was in southern France, hundreds of miles away, pointed east toward the German border. They were facing the wrong direction. Hitler's planners calculated that even if Patton tried to help, it would take weeks to pivot an entire army through a frozen winter landscape. Hitler believed he had time. He was wrong. He had forgotten that Patton didn't care about impossible. On December 19th, just 3 days after the German attack began, the impossible happened. Hitler was handed a report that defied military science. Patton had turned 133,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and 3 full divisions 90 degrees in the middle of a blinding ice storm and was already attacking the German flank. Hitler turned to his staff, his voice trembling. They had no answer. In 72 hours, Patton had performed a logistical miracle that should have taken months. The German offensive, Hitler's meticulously planned final victory, was now being torn apart by an army that shouldn't even have been there. Within days, Patton broke through to Bastogne. The German advance stalled, then shattered. Hitler finally understood the terrifying truth. You cannot plan against a man who operates on pure instinct. You cannot defend against a man who moves faster than you can think. April 22nd, 1945. The end was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The Soviet circle was closing around Berlin, and the roar of their Katyusha rockets could be heard even through the thick layers of concrete. Hitler's 56th birthday had passed 2 days prior, a hollow celebration in a tomb. In one of his final strategic conferences, surrounded by a handful of loyalists like Jodl and Keitel, the conversation turned to the Western Front. Someone mentioned the rapid advance of the Americans. For a moment, the fire returned to Hitler's eyes. He spoke about Patton one last time. According to the post-war testimony of the generals present, Hitler's tone had shifted. It was no longer the mockery of 1943 or the rage of 1944. It was something far more chilling recognition. Of all the Allied generals, Hitler allegedly said Patton was the most dangerous, not because he was the smartest, and certainly not because he had the most tanks. He was dangerous because he was the only one who truly understood what I built the Wehrmacht to do. The room went silent. Hitler continued, his voice barely a whisper against the thud of shells. Patton fights the way we were supposed to fight. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. Hitler had created the Blitzkrieg to make defensive warfare obsolete. He believed in speed and striking before the enemy could prepare, and in creating chaos so fast that the enemy's command structure would simply paralyze. Germany had done it to Poland. They had done it to France. But in the end, Patton had done it back to Germany, and he had done it better. Hitler acknowledged that speed warfare has no nationality, only practitioners. The Americans had found a man who practiced it with more soul and more aggression than even Germany's finest generals. As the bunker shook, Hitler kept asking for Patton's exact location. Not because it would change the outcome of the war, but because he viewed Patton as a force of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake. You didn't defeat a force of nature, you simply waited for it to pass. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. At that very moment, George S. Patton was in Czechoslovakia, still driving forward, still attacking. Still being the general, Hitler could never stop. History remembers the great planners like Eisenhower and the massive steamrollers like Zhukov. But Patton was different. He didn't just destroy divisions. He destroyed the enemy's confidence. He got inside Hitler's head and stayed there until the very end. Hitler's final assessment wasn't propaganda. It was the professional respect of a defeated gambler for the man who finally called his bluff. Patton proved that in modern war, chaos beats planning, and relentless forward movement beats the strongest fortress. The greatest commanders aren't always the ones with the perfect plan. Sometimes, they are the ones who make their enemies stop planning altogether. The truth of the war is often hidden in these private moments of realization. If you want to discover more untold stories from the shadows of World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Because history is never just about who won, it's about the legends who defined the fight.